Welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. Your chance to learn about the teachings of the Catholic Church on sacred music, both in theory and practice. Through interviews, discussions, and music, your hearts and minds will be lifted up and better understand what it means to sing the praise of His glory. And now, your host, Dr. Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. Our guest today is my good friend who teaches patristics at Baylor University in Texas and is the author of a series of popular books, including Drinking with the Saints and Dining with the Saints, in addition to all of his meteor work on St. Augustine, Dr. Michael Foley. We talk about the Rogation Days, a little bit about the Ember Days, and the need of modern man for both these elements in the calendar and their accompanying external acts. If this is a topic that interests you, I'd recommend to you our summer class here at the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music, The History of the Roman Rite, which meets July 24th to the 28th. And it promises to be a great overview of Western liturgical history, helping make sense of liturgy today. We've got a few spots left in that class, even as some of our other classes have filled up, especially in their online spots, heading into our application deadline of May 1st. Check it out at our website, catholicinstituteofsacredmusic.org. And now, on to the interview. It's great to have you on the show. Thanks for joining me today, Mike.
It's a pleasure to be on. Thanks for having me, Jenny.
So a frequent subject here on the podcast is the meaningfulness of time. And, many of our listeners are musicians, and we, of course, have a very acute sense of the movement through time as the basis of our art. But this all becomes heightened in the experience of liturgical time as the sun rises and sets and the moon waxes and wanes. It seems to me that, especially in our age, people have a deep hunger for meaning and identity, and both these are embedded for the Christian in the liturgical structure of time. I'm wondering if you could share with our listeners a little bit about what you observe in that regard. I'm thinking especially of your work in Texas at Baylor, where you're surrounded by both, the typical kind of post-Christian culture, but also by a lot of faithful Christians, but who don't have a sense of the liturgical schedule in the same way that we do as Catholics. What do you see as the desires of modern man's heart that are fulfilled in the liturgical passage of time?
Oh, where to begin? I guess I would begin by saying it's not necessarily modern man. It's all humanity. Our human nature yearns for marking the passages of time. And as a musician, I'm sure you're aware of, there is a hymn by St. Ambrose, or attributed to St. Ambrose, wherein it is claimed that God gave us the seasons to relieve our boredom. And I think there's much truth to that. We Catholics don't have a boring year. There are all kinds of exciting ways that the passage of time is marked. And that does speak to a deep human yearning. And I would argue, if there's anything to be said for modern man, it's not that he needs this less, he needs it more, because he's already disconnected from the rhythms of nature in so many ways. The very fact that we can have all kinds of food on demand, that we don't marvel at the fact that we can buy watermelons in January, which is a good, I'm not saying that's evil, but it does alienate us from nature. It makes us forget about these basic rhythms of harvesting and scarcity. So we need more of the marking of time and not less, and the liturgical year fulfills that function.
Yeah, it's really, the question, that fundamental question, is modern man capable of the liturgical act that became so infamous in the 20th century? But I think you make a great point. More, not less, not incapable. Maybe inhibited in their formation access to it, but certainly in need of it. We're releasing this podcast for the Major Rogation Day, April 25th. Could you tell us a little bit about what a Rogation Day is?
Absolutely. So speaking of the liturgical passing of time, there are two cool things in the traditional calendar, Rogation Days and Ember Days, that are especially linked with nature. And Rogation Days were special days of petitioning. Rogation comes from the Latin rogare, to ask, but it's also the Greek equivalent of litanea, litany. So it's a time of petitioning, but a time of petitioning in a procession. And so on Rogation Days, violet vestments would be used. There would be tons of petitions, and there would be long processions that often involve the blessing of the land in the hopes for a good harvest.
So, I mean, it's so wonderful to have these particular days in which we ask. So much of the liturgical experience is a sort of laying aside earthly cares and entering into that liturgy, but really being able to have like these moments where you deal with reality, like you said, the seasons, the land, and enter back in and feel like, okay, this too is a legitimate part of our experience of time and our needs expressed liturgically.
Oh, absolutely. And the Rogation tides are incredibly specific and lengthy in their petitions. We are asking for all kind of deliverance from spiritual evils, but also physical ones. As a matter of fact, there are two different sources for the Rogation Days, and one of the sources was in response to a series of natural catastrophes that a bishop in Gaul instituted the Rogation Days in response to a series of weird, freakish events of nature.
Yeah, so I'd like to get into these practices now and approach it both liturgically and paraliturgically. So could you start with the liturgical aspect of it? Are there prescribed liturgical practices? For example, is there a Rogation Mass?
Yes, there is. So there are two different sets of Rogation Days with actually two different historical origins. What we're celebrating on April 25th is what's called the Greater Rogation Day. It always falls on the feast of St. Mark, but that's a coincidence. The reason why we have the Rogation Day on April 25th is that it is the Catholic baptizing of the Roman Robigalia, which was a spring fertility petition that was done in the city of Rome. And the church was so unashamed to take over this rightful aspiration for a good harvest that it even used the same procession route as the old Roman pagan Robigalia.
There's no mistaking that intention there then.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the first origin. And then the second is what I mentioned a moment ago. Bishop Mamertus, who was in France in 470 AD, had a series of weird natural catastrophes. So he instituted what are now called the Lesser Rogation Days. They take place 3 days in a row on the Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday before Ascension Thursday. And so to answer your question, there is a proper Mass for these events and also a proper procession, which consists of the Litany of the Saints and a series of collects.
Great. So it's only coincidental, but are they two different Mass formularies, or are they, that you could have a Rogation Mass on April 25th, or you could have the Mass of St. Mark on 25th?
That is correct. So they are two different things. You have an option, the Rogation Mass or the Mass of St. Mark. And if for whatever reason the Mass of St. Mark is transferred, the Rogation Mass and the Greater Litanies are not. They always stay on April 25th, even if the Feast of St. Mark gets transferred for whatever reason.
Great. That kind of touches on the liturgical aspect of it, but let's talk about the paraliturgical practices. You already mentioned the procession with its proper collect and assigned litanies, whatever. So, that's paraliturgical in one sense. But it's prescribed also in the Roman ritual, is my understanding. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that aspect of it, the procession, and what other customs might have happened on Rogation Days.
Well, the big thing in England was, as a part of the procession, there was what was called the beating of the bounds, that the priest and the entire parish would circle the boundaries of the parish. And that would take the whole day, because the size of the parish could be sizable. And there would be several stations where they would stop and they would refresh themselves with both food and sometimes strong drink. And sometimes these things got out of hand, because if after several rounds of ale, one party that was beating the bounds came across another parish that was beating the bounds at the same time, they would sometimes start beating each other.
Oh no. One sees how this can incur the ire of church and civil authorities.
Exactly.
Were there other particular practices in terms of the culinary and bibational experience of it that coincided with the Rogation Days?
There were no special foods specifically for Rogation Days. I mentioned the ale that would be consumed during the beating of the bounds. There were, however, some other interesting customs. The English refer to these actually as gang days because the word gang literally means to walk about. And so the gang days were the days we did a lot of walking, beating these bounds. And in parts of England, they would have sort of a giant paper mache dragon that would be part of the procession. And it was kind of showing that we were petitioning against Satan for all these things. And then on the third of the Lesser Rogation Days, they would cut the dragon's tail to symbolize that Christ, who's about to ascend, is going to hear their prayers.
Oh my gosh. So actually this brings out a bigger question too, just about the main difference between the lesser and greater Rogation Days. Is it that you would also use the Mass formulary on the Lesser Rogation Days, or was it only the paraliturgical stuff?
So you would use the Mass for all those days. Why did they call them one day greater than the other three lesser? Maybe because it's the Roman rite, so they were prejudiced for the Roman custom. And when the Gallic custom came in, they ascribed it, the title of lesser. But the Lesser Rogation Days, I think, were more important in places like England and France than the one on April 25th.
Do you see any holdovers from the Rogation Days that you've come across in popular culture? I mean, you mentioned the phrase beating the bounds, which we've heard of before, but like in this post-Christian sort of era, and even before that, do you see any holdovers into Protestant America, for example?
Well, the Anglicans still continue to beat the bounds, and they call the Sunday before Ascension Thursday Rogation Sunday to this very day. It's still a custom in England. It's cool to see the Ember Days in American Catholicism making a minor comeback. There was big talk about them a couple of years ago as a kind of atonement for the priestly abuse scandal. And so even churches that celebrate the new rite were observing the Ember Days. But sadly, I haven't seen much in Catholic circles about the Rogation Days, which is a shame because there is one famous story from Minnesota from 1876, a Catholic community praying to Our Lady to stop a grasshopper plague. And they promised her, if you stop this plague, we will build a chapel in your honor, and we will go there during the Rogation Days. And Our Lady answered their prayers. A winter storm came over that night, and it froze all of the little grasshoppers just as they were hatching. So they built Grasshopper Chapel on the top of this hill, and above the doors is a relief of the Blessed Virgin Mary, flanked by two grasshoppers bowing down to her.
Wow, that's such a great story. So actually, this opens up the broader conversation too about into Ember Days. So could you describe to us a little bit about what Ember Days are?
Absolutely. It's a common misconception to conflate the two. They are similar in that they both hearken to nature, but they hearken to nature in a different way. The Ember Days are a liturgical commemoration of the four natural seasons. The word ember is a corruption of the Latin word for seasons, tempora. The Rogation Days also hearken to nature, but vis-a-vis our human agricultural interaction with nature, right? The Spring Ember Days celebrate spring qua spring. The Rogation Days petition God for a good planting of the crop so we can have a good harvest. That's not just appreciating nature as nature. That is a more specifically tailored petition. So they're not interchangeable.
Right. So could you also expound upon the liturgical practices, for example, the additional readings and that sort of thing for for the liturgies for Ember Days?
So in the traditional Roman Rite, you would only have additional readings during penitential days. Not that you were being punished, but that it was a time for greater training, greater ascesis. So the Ember Days are one of the few times in the 1962 Missal where there are more than 2 readings. Sometimes there can be as many as 4, I think, maybe even 5. So you have additional readings during the Ember Days. Another big deal was that Ember Days were days of mandatory fasting. Even the Ember Days of summer, which fell during the octave of Pentecost, were mandatory days of fasting. Not so with the Rogation Days. They're often associated with fasting, but the church, as far as I know, was reluctant to impose fasting during the 40 days of Easter. So you can be penitential during the lesser Rogation Days, but I don't think you're allowed to fast before Ascension Thursday.
I see. Yeah. And could you talk a little bit about the schema of the Wednesday, Friday, Saturday for the liturgical outlay of the Ember Days?
It's a very ancient tradition. We have this very early document called the Didache, which some people suspect may have been written before some of the books of the New Testament, that's how old it is. It goes probably back to the 1st century AD. And one of the first things it mentions about Christians is that they're not like the hypocrites who fast on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And the hypocrites are the Pharisees. We're not like them. We fast on Wednesdays and Fridays. So there was a very early tradition of weekly fasting every Wednesday and Friday. And then in the church in Rome, it was Saturday as well. Saturday was also a day of penance and fasting. So it used to be that Christians would fast 2 to 3 times a week. And then eventually that got reduced, but it was preserved in the Ember Days.
You know, it's so interesting to just think about fasting. This is kind of tangential to the question, but again, thinking about the needs of modern man's heart, like we see so many things about intermittent fasting and the health benefits, or like meatless Mondays, which always drove me crazy. Why not like make the meatless Fridays so make a bunch of people happy instead of the alliteration of meatless Mondays? Anyway, that's just my little soapbox. But I think, again, this is something that the church really has to offer people, that this is envisioned in your life, and it's so much bigger than your physical health. It's a right ordering of everything.
Oh, it's so true. And not to get cranky, but it really is unfortunate that just as modern Western man began to have this new realization about the importance of reconnecting with nature, the importance of things like periodic fasting, just as all these movements started to gain traction in the 60s and 70s, the church was throwing them out. Just as secular man was showing an interest in this, the church is saying, oh, well, we don't need this anymore. And it's a shame. Like, there's a way in which we, as I was saying, we need the Ember Days and the Rogation Days now more than ever, since the average human being is alienated from nature.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course, the council envisioned that these would make their way, the liturgical reform after the council envisioned that these would make their way into national calendars according to, perhaps a more seasonally appropriate sense of the passage of time and the seasons in each different country. But of course, in very few places do I don't know of any actually bishops' conference that actually did include the Ember and Rogation Days in their calendar as they were supposed to. There was, as you mentioned, that discussion about that at the USCCB for a particular way of doing penance. But what might someone do to encourage this practice, even in the absence of that declaration and the conference level, or maybe even to create a sort of groundswell of practice and desire for this, so that it would make a really clear case for them to be re-included in the calendar?
Good question. I mean, the problem is not even the bishops really understand what Ember Days and Rogation Days are, since none of them probably have a living memory of it. Very few do. You're right that they were supposed to be put on the national conference calendars. But no, I think the only exception was Germany. Germany likes to follow orders. And so they were the only ones who did. Or at least they used to like to follow orders. Maybe not so much anymore. I mentioned Grasshopper Hill. There is a more recent example. And I know that, Jenny, you will appreciate this because it's about the Dakotas.
Really?
Yes. So there is a National Catholic Rural Conference. I'm getting the name screwed up, but they continue to promote Rogation Tide. And I read an article that claimed there was a priest in, forgive me, it was either North Dakota or South Dakota, that on the Rogation Days, he blessed the crops with holy water from a crop duster.
Oh, boy. I don't think that's in the Roman ritual, is it?
But what a litany of the saints that would be.
Yeah, that's great.
I was doing an article on the Rogation Days, so I actually contacted the chancellor of the diocese because the article had been written about 10 years earlier. And I said, so are you aware of this going on? And he laughed and he said, I don't know of any of my priests doing this, but I can think of at least 3 who are crazy enough to do it.
So perhaps in the absence of access to a crop duster, people might sing some litanies on these days.
Yeah. And just tell your priest about it. Ask him to get involved. What my family does is we beat the bounds of our little half acre in our little, parcel of suburbia. And every now and then we get quizzical looks from the neighbors, but it actually is pretty cool. It's a way of sanctifying your property. It's a way of giving God thanks for it. But then you could also ask your priest to do a parish event. We did this with the Ember Days in our parish, and I don't see why you couldn't do it with the Rogation Days as well. Yeah. They're not suppressed.
Right. Yeah. And I think, the public witness of things like processions and that connection to nature, to the land is something that's inherently attractive as a way of inviting people into parish life and the Catholic sense of time.
I concur.
Well, thanks so much for this, Mike. It's always great to talk to you.
Lovely talking to you, Jenny. Take care. Happy Rogation Day.
Thanks.
We hope you've enjoyed listening to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast with Dr. Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka. For more information about this episode, sacred music resources, or upcoming events, visit our website at sacredmusicpodcast.com. You can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, or your favorite podcast app. If you enjoy our podcast, please write us a review on iTunes. This improves our iTunes ranking and helps others find out about the podcast. The music you heard at the beginning of this episode is Hec Dies by William Byrd, sung by the London Oratory Schola Cantorum Boys Choir, directed by Charles Cole from the CD Sacred Treasures of England. The music at the conclusion of this podcast is from the Prelude and Fugue in G Major, BWV 550 by Johann Sebastian Bach, performed by Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka. We look forward to having you join us next time, and until then, may we sing the praise of His glory.